Good afternoon, and welcome to the Akron Roundtable. I'm John Williams, President of the Akron Roundtable Board of Directors. Akron Roundtable has proudly promoted community dialogue and networking for the past 45 years. Our mission is to present speakers who inform and educate listeners on diverse topics of importance to the region, the nation, and the world. While we typically enjoy meeting in person, today's format is indeed a different but effective venue for Akron Roundtable. We're delighted to meet with you virtually, so please join in the conversation by participating in the Q&A at the end of the program. We sincerely thank the Akron Summit County Public Library for continuing to host our virtual events. Today's program will be broadcast on Thursday, February 24th at 8 p.m. on WKSU 89.7 FM. It is our privilege to welcome to the roundtable today Jessica Jones Capparell, Director of Government Affairs, League of Women Voters of the United States, for part one of our two-part point counterpoint series on voting. Her topic is expanding access and ending discrimination, the current fight for voting rights. We are thankful for the generous support Akron Roundtable receives from supporters, patrons, and subscribers. You too can financially support Akron Roundtable by giving to our website at akronroundtable.org to make a contribution. On our website, you will also find a list of our board members and staff. I'd like to take a moment to thank our staff and board members for their hard work. I'm very fortunate to serve alongside such an outstanding group of community leaders dedicated to the Akron Roundtable mission. Please mark your calendar now for our next event, Thursday, March 17th, when we transition back in-person talks at the Quaker Station. We will present part two of our two-part counterpoint series on voting with Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation. You can read more about our upcoming speakers by going to our website. Also, on podcast page of our website, you can listen to the past Akron Roundtable programs. We are grateful to the University of Akron and its EXL Center for Experiential Learning for sponsoring our podcast series. Again, our website address is akronroundtable.org. For those of you on social media, please follow us at Akron Roundtable on Facebook. Listen on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and use hashtag Akron Roundtable to continue the conversation. In just a moment, our speaker, Jessica Jones Capparell, will be introduced by Akron Roundtable board member and president-elect Emma Liebreth Osborne. Following her presentation, Jessica has generously agreed to take questions from our audience. Board member Jennifer Ross will coordinate the Q&A portion of the program. To facilitate your questions, we'll be using Asker technology. Asker technology enables you to submit questions via mobile devices. Questions may be submitted at any time during our program and will be forwarded for review during the Q&A portion. Watch the chat box for instructions should you need them. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce Emma Liebreth Osborne.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon to have a discussion on a very important topic. So I am proud to introduce our speaker today. Jessica Jones Capparell is the Director of Government Affairs at the League of Women Voters of the United States. Jessica manages the relationships and strategic planning for federal legislation and lobbying that benefit that organization. Additionally, she advises and assists with aligning advocacy and legislative priorities at all levels of the organization. With a decade of experience at the organization, Jessica has become an expert in league policy positions. She works to implement strategic campaigns in coordination with staff, league members, and organizational partners around the country. Jessica also manages the day-to-day operations of the league's volunteer lobby corps. Before joining the league, Jessica worked on political campaigns throughout the United States, mainly focusing on grassroots engagement and running statewide operations with communications. Jessica resides in Washington, D.C. with her husband and son, and we are very excited to welcome her to today's Akron Roundtable. Jessica?
Thank you so much, Emma. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. There we go. All right. Hi, thank you so much, Emma. Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much to the Akron Roundtable for having me today. I'm excited to talk a little bit about what the state of voting rights and the current fight for voting rights, both federally and in states across the country. Before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about the League of Women Voters and who we are. The League of Women Voters is a national organization with affiliates in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. We are active in over 700 communities around the country. I hope that maybe there are some league members on the call today. We, of course, believe in the power of women to create a more perfect democracy. Our mission statement is empower voters and defend democracy. It's been our vision since 1920 when the League was founded, coming out of the women's suffrage movement. We just turned earlier this week 102 years old. We are a nonpartisan organization made up of activists from the grassroots perspective, and we believe voters should play a critical role in our democracy. And most of our public policy and all of our messaging is directed from a voter's perspective. So we're always fighting for voters. So let's get to our topic, the state of voting rights. Before I launch into a little bit of some background and what's going on today, I want you to know that even though we have had some setbacks and there's a lot of negative talk, I think, in the media about what is happening around voting rights, there's also a lot of hope. And there's a lot of hope because we see a lot of participation from voters across the country in our elections, in our redistricting processes, and in our government in general. So let's talk a little bit about a timeline in particular of federal voting rights laws. So we all know in 1789, the Constitution established authority for the states to set voting rights for folks in the states. Largely, voting rights was given to white male property owners. So we were already starting from a deficit when the US Constitution was adopted. In 1870, during Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment was adopted, preventing the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. But we also know that at that time, that didn't necessarily mean that predominantly Black voters were able to vote in Southern states. In 1920, the founding of the League of Women Voters and also the establishment of the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, but also predominantly that was for white women. 1943, Chinese immigrants were given the right to vote. In 1948, states continued to extend voting rights to Native Americans and giving them the right to vote in state and federal elections. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed, ensuring that full voting protections were given to Black voters. In 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 down to 18, so giving 18 to 21-year-olds the right to vote. In 1993, the National Voter Registration Act was enacted to ensure that we had uniform voter registration activities across the entire country. In 2002, the Help America Vote Act, which established the Election Assistance Commission, was enacted. But then, so we have all of this progress, and of course, in between 1965 and 2002, we had the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act on multiple occasions. The last reauthorization of that happened in 2006. And then after that reauthorization, the Voting Rights Act was challenged. And the Voting Rights Act is recognized as, is widely recognized as one of the nation's most effective civil rights statutes. More than 40 years after the civil rights movement, the VRA continues to play a vital role in preventing discriminatory voting measures. And the legislation itself has helped the U.S. Department of Justice block over 700 racially discriminatory voting measures between 1982 and 2006. Upon that last reauthorization in 2006, it was done with overwhelming bipartisan support. It passed in the Senate 98 to nothing. Congress declared with that overwhelming support that without the VRA's protection, racial and language minority citizens would have been deprived of the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. We continue to need the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, to combat second-generation barriers and discrimination that's less visible than what occurred decades ago. But after the reauthorization in 2006, we go to 2013 when the Supreme Court guts the heart of the Voting Rights Act. The decision in Shelby County v. Holder revolved around Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which established a coverage formula to determine which states would and which local governments would fall under Section 5. And Section 5 established pre-clearance, and therefore therefore those folks need to get approval before changing their voting laws. The justices ruled that the formula that was used in Section 4 was unconstitutional, and that it needed to be revised, even though it had been revised and extended several times by Congress. The formula could no longer be used to establish those pre-clearance requirements. So it eliminated the opportunity for the Justice Department to challenge those discriminatory voting laws before they went into place. The conditions that originally justified those measures, the court said that the conditions that originally justified those measures no longer characterized voting in covered jurisdictions. This set off a firestorm across the country. Within 24 hours of the decision to strike down the heart of the Voting Rights Act, multiple states filed to laws challenging and making changes that had previously been rejected by the Justice Department, including voter ID laws. In fact, it only took a few hours for the state of Texas to move forward on its voter ID law, which is considered the strictest in the nation. The law required Texans to prove their citizenship and their residency in the state. And in order to qualify to do that, you need to present forms of ID that are expensive and difficult to obtain for some low-income Americans. It required a passport, the cheapest of which is $55, or a copy of the birth certificate, which not all Americans, particularly older ones, have. And the court had previously blocked the law in 2012 because it discriminated against Latino and Black voters. So as soon as the Shelby County decision happened, multiple states filed to reenact or repass the legislation that had already been deemed discriminatory by courts and by the Department of Justice. Now, there's a lot of bad things to talk about, right? But there's also a lot of good things to talk about. And when we get to the 2020 elections, we've had all of these discriminatory voting laws that we've talked about, but we've also had some really great election administration reforms that have passed, and we like to call these pro-voter reforms. So when we're talking about pro-voter reforms, we're also talking about expanding access for people, breaking down those barriers that exist for people to register to vote, to stand in line at the polls, or make sure that they can vote before election day or outside of election day if it's better for them. Things like online voter registration. We do everything online. We even meet online, right? We're meeting today online. Shouldn't we be able to offer voter registration online? Some states do this, and it's been greatly expanded and since the Shelby decision and before, but we can keep going. We can keep doing more, making sure that people can register to vote online, and then not only do that, if they move, if they are name changes, they can update their registration online as well. There's also been a great expansion in automatic voter registration. And automatic voter registration occurs when you interact with a government entity, usually with the Department of Motor Vehicles or the DMV in your state. You're automatically registered to vote, and that takes the burden off of saying that answering the question, or it takes the burden off of the DMV worker from asking the question if someone wants to be registered to vote, from filling out a form. They automatically send the information that you have already supplied, that's the word, that you have already supplied to the Secretary of State or to the elections officer to ensure that you're registered to vote. And that cuts down on clerical errors and it cuts down on the time needed to process paper forms as well. There's also been a great expansion in no excuse absentee voting. And we saw this a lot right before the 2020 election. This pandemic has hit everyone hard and it hit everyone in different ways. But it also had a great impact on the way that people vote, how they vote, and how they vote and where they vote. So in 2020, we saw states expand the opportunity for folks to receive ballots in their homes, either through the mail or by picking up a ballot at your local registrar or your election administrator's office and taking it back home where you can vote in private and then either bring it back and put it in a ballot box outside of your election administrator's office or mail it back. It also expanded in-person early voting so that people could vote outside of election day to ensure that they're not standing in long lines on election day, that they not keeping social distancing. But it also, the 2020 election was really great because it gave so many voters so many great opportunities to vote in the way that they felt the most comfortable. So if you wanted to vote early, you could do that. If you wanted to vote by mail or through a paper ballot in your home, you could do that. If you still wanted to go to the election, to your polling location on election day and vote, you could do that as well. And because of it, we saw that the 2020 election saw the greatest participation in our nation's history. Throughout election season, the league worked tirelessly to ensure that voters had the information and the access to make their voices heard. We also had to fight a lot of rampant mis and disinformation about our elections and unprecedented attempts to disenfranchise voters or push anti-voter reforms. And the league found new and innovative ways to impact voters. 2020 was about more than historic turnout. It's about the ways that we are able to give people access to vote. But after the 2020 election, we've seen a lot of legislation in the states. And a lot of the legislation in the states is attempting, we call them anti-voter laws, attempting to roll back the expansion that we saw in the 2020 election. So in 2021 in legislatures across the country, we saw that 19 states actually were able to enact 34 anti-voter laws. They're able to roll back access to voting. So rolling back the opportunity to vote via absentee, meaning you have to have an excuse to vote absentee, rolling back early voting hours, They also rolled back different voting methods and challenged election administrators. We've seen elections officials all across the country be threatened with their jobs because of the outcome of the election. And that's really not fair to them. Our election administrators are truly the best people out there. They operate with a good faith that they are taking the votes of people and they're counting them in the way that they were cast. So we've seen a lot of threats to our election administrators. This year in 2022, legislators in at least 27 states have introduced or pre-filed. So pre-filing is when you can file something before your legislature returns. But we've also seen them carry over legislation that maybe was introduced in 2021. And for those of you who need a little bit of a refresher on how legislatures work, we know that legislatures happen in usually in 2-year cycles. So 2021 and 2022 are the same legislative session. They're just in 2 different pieces. So you can carry bills over from 2021 into 2022 in most states. And so we've seen bills, over 250 restrictive bills introduced, pre-filed, or carried over in 2022. But we've also seen that in 32 states, we've seen bills that have been introduced, pre-filed, or carried over 399 bills that have expanded voting access. So it's not all bad news. There's some good news out there. There's actually a bill in Ohio that I'm going to just briefly touch on in a couple of minutes that has some good and some bad as well. But it also is all the anti-voter legislation across the states reminds us of why we need federal voting rights protections. A couple of weeks ago, the House passed a bill called the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. It's a bill that combined 2 pieces of legislation, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. It combined them together. They passed it in the House and they sent it over to the Senate. Now they combined them because they knew that they would have a better shot at passing one whole bill. And it combines some of the election administration pieces that I've already talked about to expand access. Things like universal online voting registration, universal automatic voter registration, same-day registration. So if you have moved and you haven't had a chance to re-register at your current address before Election Day, you can go to your polling location on Election Day, you can register and you can vote a ballot. That's a big reform that the League works to support across the country. Things like that. It also has some money in politics provisions, getting big money out of politics, making sure that voters know where the money is coming from. Voters deserve to know who is trying to influence their votes. And so those are some of the pieces in the Freedom to Vote Act. And then it also combined it with the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is the fix to the Voting Rights Act that is so desperately needed to end the discriminatory voting practices that we've seen pop up all around the country, and give the federal government, and in particular the Department of Justice, the right to challenge those laws before they go into effect. But even though the House passed it and sent it over to the Senate and had the large backing of President Biden, the Senate is split 50-50, and Senate Democrats were unable to advance voting rights legislation because they were unable to get votes to change the filibuster rule. So in the Senate, you have to have 60 votes for anything to end debate and move on to final passage. So Democrats failed to move the bill forward, but we also need to make sure that we are putting the onus on Republicans. We have a 50-50 Senate. So our Democrats and Republicans need to work together very closely to ensure that anything that goes in this that needs to get passed for the good of the country, they're doing in a bipartisan manner. This is a really great opportunity for our leaders to come together to find compromise and pass real change. Some of the same Republicans that supported the 2006 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act and had a lot of really great things to say about why we still needed the VRA, failed to support the Voting Rights Act and move it forward within parts of that bill. So we still need federal voting rights protections to stop those the bills that are coming out of states that prevent Black, Brown, Native American, other communities of color, Asian Americans, those with disabilities, some with students, prevent them from voting in the election. We should want to have the same success that the 2020 election had in the 2022 election and the 2024 election and beyond. Before we go to Q&A, normally I like to give people something to do after I have given this overview of what's happening in the states, what's happening at the federal government. So I tried to do that a little bit today. Federally, I think it's really hard to say what you can do right now. There are some other efforts to bring forth some changes to the Electoral Counts Act and maybe pair some of the other voting rights provisions with this bill moving forward. It will remain to be seen as senators come together to decide what those reforms will be. But I think we do know that we need some type of federal voting rights legislation to bring all states onto the same level. So if what I have talked about today has inspired you, maybe you've been moved by some of the injustices that I've talked about, and you want to ask your representatives and your senators to do whatever it takes to make voting rights legislation that restores the Voting Rights Act, especially so that voters of color are not purposely kept away from casting their ballots, you can ask them to do whatever it takes to end discrimination in voting. And you can do that by calling the Capitol switchboard and just asking for your representative, and they'll direct you to their office. You can also call their local offices in your own towns. In state, I just want to throw it to some of the actions our Ohio League is doing. We have several local leagues all across the state, a few, even one in Akron. There are some actions by our friends over at LWV Ohio pushing to amend HB 294, which is a bill that does, like I said earlier, does some good, but also works to shorten absentee ballot request periods, does some things making voter ID requirements confusing and restrictive, and it also reduces access to drop boxes, which are also used for registration purposes and voting purposes. Redistricting is also still ongoing in Ohio. This is the first redistricting cycle without the protections of the Voting Rights Act that we have talked about. So all across the country, we're seeing maps sliced and diced, methodically drawn to take away the representation of communities across the country. But so you can visit lwvohio.org for all the latest news and information and some action alerts specific to your state. Finally, it is an election year, as we have talked about. There's never been a better time to check on your voter registration or to find out what you need to take with you to go to the polls if you're not sure, or maybe there's this new law does pass and there's some things that are updated that you need to know about. And you can do that by going to Vote 411, which is the league's one-stop shop for all of your voter information about what's on your ballot, what you need to take with you to vote, and more. So I hope I've given a good overview of what's happening around the country. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we can go to some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for that amazing, for one, sharing your thoughts and giving us both a historical and current overview of voting rights here. We have a few questions from the audience that I'm going to share with you. And once again, as a reminder, if you have questions that you would like to submit to Jessica, please go to www.asker.iou/Akron Roundtable, and we'll definitely try to share your questions out. So the very first question that we have is, how do you respond to the point of view that reform is necessary to stop election fraud?
That's a good question. I would challenge the fact that there is election fraud. We see very few cases of voter fraud, and very few at all, right? So I actually would challenge the premise of the question, and then. So as far as individuals voting, I think everyone, when you register to vote, when you go to vote, you are attesting that you are that person, that you are making these decisions on your own. And I think, like, when I sign an affidavit, when anyone signs something that you are affirming who you are, and that's subject to federal or state penalties, like, I take that very seriously. And I also don't know anyone that doesn't take that seriously. So I don't think that people are willingly putting themselves into a position where they are going to be fined or imprisoned. So I would challenge the fact that there's voter fraud. And when we talk about election fraud, our election administrators are doing everything in their power. They take their jobs very seriously. They count the votes. I believe that they count the votes as their office dictates. So, I would also challenge that as well.
Thank you. Our next question is that the next speaker in the Point Counterpoint series asserts that our current election process is not free, fair, and honest. How do you respond to this?
Well, I'd say that the league is always fighting to make sure that our election process is free, fair, honest, and accessible. And that's why we do so much work to ensure that voters have access to registration, that they have access to education materials about who their candidates are, about what they need to take with them to vote. I am familiar with the work of the next speaker. And I would say that, the work that the league does to ensure that voters have the access and voters have the connection and the right to vote is incredibly important. And really, it's all about making sure that voters have the information that they need to vote and ensure access to the polls.
Thank you. So we know that there's lots of campaigns going on around voting rights. So another question says, are the Get Out to Vote campaigns enough to overcome the voter suppression laws?
I mean, I also, as Emma mentioned earlier, I come from a campaign background. So I have worked on Get Out the Vote efforts. I think that it's up to all of us, not just candidates, not just organizations like the league. I think it is up to all of us to ensure that our family, that our friends, that our neighbors, that we are all going out and exercising this incredibly important right that we are given, the right to vote. So it's up to all of us to make sure that we are getting out the vote of all of the people. And when we talk about mis and disinformation, right, it is our job to challenge the information that is being delivered to us. We should all be working and striving to verify information that is correct, find sources that you trust, whether it's the league, whether it's another trusted community organization. It's up to all of us to challenge information that's being put out there and to share the truth.
Thank you. So we have a viewer that's sharing their experience at a polling location, and they have a question around that. So they said, at my polling location this year, there were loud protesters just over the 100 feet line that is protected in Ohio. Do you see legislation preventing this or extending the protected area?
I think that would depend on the jurisdiction or the state itself. Polling, what's the word? Not easement. Those restrictions are set by the jurisdictions themselves. I do know that it's hard for some of us who might live in a neighborhood that might have protesters to go up to vote. I know that I would be intimidated and afraid to cross through those protesters, right?
Mhm.
That I'm a white woman, but I also know that that other communities of color might also be more intimidated than I would and turn around and decide not to vote, right? So I would say it depends on the jurisdiction. I haven't seen anything specific related to that, but I know that there's been a lot of conversation around it, but I haven't seen anything specific.
So are there any restrictions on voting in which you or the league agree?
Any restrictions, like, can you say a little bit more, Jennifer?
I'm just asking the question, so they just said generically. Are there any restrictions on voting with which you or the league agree? Sorry.
That's okay. That's the question. The league really works to break down barriers for voters. So I think I would want to talk to that person a little bit more and have a little bit more in-depth conversation. But like we feel like our job is to break down barriers and to ensure that voters have all the information, have all of the access, and have all the opportunities that they need to vote.
Okay. And feel free to share more info for that person who submitted that question. Does the John Lewis Voting Rights Act still have a chance, in your opinion?
I'm never going to give up on the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. It is my personal professional goal to make sure that the Voting Rights Act is restored. I think it's a good bill, and based on past reauthorizations, I don't see how there's any way that we can't get Democrats and Republicans together to move this forward, especially with so much bipartisan support in the past. So I'm never going to give up on it. I don't know if it's realistic to say that it will pass in this session of Congress, but know that there are many people like myself who are never going to give up.
So some of the new laws seem unnecessary and are often unfair because voter fraud has not been a problem, but it could be. Does the league have a standard for voting laws, giving access and ensuring no fraud?
So there are a number of pro-voter reforms that we have worked on that do need some restrictions, and I wouldn't say restrictions, but they need some guide rails. So for example, with automatic voter registration, which is a pro-voter reform that we support, we want to make sure that whoever is registering to vote is actually eligible to register to vote. If we have someone who is, maybe is not a citizen, we don't want them to accidentally get registered to vote and open themselves up to prosecution or fines or deportation, right? If they say that they're not eligible, then they shouldn't be registered to vote. And so things like that, we need to put some guardrails in to protect those people, to ensure that they are not registered to vote and they're not able to take advantage of things like that. So there are some guardrails that are needed. There's a lot of online voter registration that is directly connected to DMVs, Departments of Motor Vehicles, and to driver's licenses. And that makes it really easy to connect directly to the information that's stored. But there's also some people out there who can't drive. Like if I am vision disabled, I'm not going to be able to drive. So I might not have a driver's license. I might have a state issued ID, But there are certainly some things that need some guide rails and need some help to make them right. I'm not sure that exactly answers the questions, but there are some restrictions and guide rails that are needed on certain things.
Thank you. So how much do you think the huge differences between candidates fed into the record participation this year?
So the League's a nonpartisan organization, so I don't know if I can comment on candidates specifically.
Okay, we'll go to another question.
Okay.
So beyond advocacy, what would you like to see more from citizens to support broader access to voting? And there's a second part. Are there any local organizations in Summit County where people can volunteer to taxi voters?
So for the second part of the question, I would say go to lwv.org and plug in your zip code and see if there's a local league near you. There's also really great organizations like the Urban League, like Common Cause, like the NAACP that are have local chapters and local affiliates that you can get involved with to work on voting rights issues. I'm sorry, I forgot the first half of the question.
And so beyond advocacy, what would you like to see more of from citizens to support broader access to voting?
I think conversation. And I mean, I think everything in life is a little bit of advocacy, whether you're advocating for yourself or you're advocating for an issue or someone else. But I would just like to see more conversation. I feel like sometimes, and this is from my own personal experience as well, like we just, especially with pandemic, right? We don't get outside of our houses as much, or at least here in DC, we don't. I'd love to see more conversation, more talking to our neighbors about what affects us. It doesn't have to be in a political perspective. It can be something as simple as that neighbor down the street's not mowing their lawn, or last summer my neighbors all banded together to get speed bumps, right? Because we saw all these these big going down our street, and we wanted to stop getting people going so fast. I guess that's advocacy too, but more conversation can lead to better understanding and better community, and then gives people an opportunity to band together for whatever they want to do, even if it's whether it's voting or a block party or anything else.
Thank you. So are any of the 399 bills expanding voter access in the red states or initiated by Republican legislators?
That is I know that there are some in red states, yes. I don't know the partisan makeup of who introduced them. I'm trying to think, I think there may be a bill that I recently talked to someone about in either Kentucky or Alabama that might be supported by a Republican legislator, but I don't have that information quite in front of me. But I do know that there are good bills that are introduced in both blue and in red states.
Okay. And so are there any countries or communities that you think are leading the way with a free, flexible, and accessible voting system that is securely and digitally integrated?
I'm really more of an expert on the American election system. And I will say, much like I have hope for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to get passed in the future, I think that the American election system is doing a lot of things right. We wouldn't have had such a great turnout in the 2020 election if we weren't able to expand access and to give people the opportunities to vote in the ways that work for them. If we wouldn't have had that turnout if we didn't have those things. So I do think that the American election system is doing well, but there's always improvements that we can make.
Good. How do these anti-voter laws affect young voters? Do you see a drop in participation from 18 to 29-year-olds?
So when we talk about anti-voter bills that affect young people, sometimes it is mostly in connection to voter photo IDs. If we have students who are living in living in Ohio, but are from Pennsylvania, but they want to vote in Ohio in their college address. Sometimes they're, and I don't know, actually, I should say I use those states as an example. I'm not super duper familiar with the specifics of Ohio voter ID, so I don't want to mislead anyone there. But I do want to say, you know, we should, if students want to vote, if they live in Ohio, they have a permanent residence there, they rent an apartment, they should be able to vote for the elected officials that make decisions about their life in the state that they, in the state that they live the most in, and or the community they live the most in. And so when we have voter ID laws that prevent them from using their student IDs as an ID that allows them to register and to vote, then that, you know, then they have to go back to their original, where their parents live, and get an absentee ballot, but maybe they don't have an excuse. I mean, there's a lot of different things. So sometimes when we talk about preventing young people from voting, we're talking about restrictive ID laws that prevent them from using their student or campus IDs to vote in the place where they live.
Thank you. And so I have a question, and I have one more question. This is my personal question. How do you think we can get Black and Brown and Indigenous people to trust the voting system more, and to become more engaged as well? Because I think a lot of them feel like the voting system just doesn't work for them.
Yeah. From what I know about the communities of color that vote, it is largely a family activity, and I think that, you know, if we want to get people to trust the system, then we have to make it work for them. We have to stop intentionally trying to take away access for them to vote, right? In 2020, we saw a huge expansion of the electorate. We saw a huge expansion of the electorate, particularly in communities of color, particularly in communities that are historically underrepresented within our government. But then we turned around in 2021 and 2022 and saw a huge swath of bills that tried to take away that right to vote. If we want people to trust the system, we have to stop trying to take away their access to voting.
Thank you. And that was a good answer. Final question.
I'd love to hear your answer to that question too.
Final question. We'll talk off the record. So this is the final question. As you said, we saw record turnout at the polls in 2020. How do we keep those voters engaged and motivated so they want to come back? Yeah,
it's really hard to be a motivated voter sometimes with everything going on, right? Well, we have to show them what their votes produced. Lawmakers have to live up to the promises that they made, and this goes for Democrats and Republicans, right? You have to show voters that you are you're delivering on the promises that you made, and people have to know that their vote is their voice, and that is how we create change. And if your legislators or your president or your governor or whoever you're voting for isn't living up to the promises, the best opportunity to hold them accountable for that is through your vote. And so that's how we keep people engaged. We show them the change that they have been able to affect and how they've been able to instill. And then we also tell them that if they don't like it, they don't like the progress that has been made, or they disagree with the things that have been done, they have a right and opportunity to use their voice, to use their vote, and to take it in a different direction.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for taking this time out with us just to chat with us and to, share your thoughts and the league's thoughts around voting rights. We appreciate you, and I'm going to hand it back over to John from here.
Jessica, thank you very much for being with us today. On behalf of the Roundtable, it is my pleasure to present you with this contemplative son as a thank you for your time with us today. This work of art was designed exclusively for Akron Roundtable by Akron Roundtable artist Don Drum. Thank you again all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in person on March 17th at the Quaker Station for part 2 of our 2-part counterpoint series on voting. Everyone have a wonderful day.